Hello Earth-friendly viewers. On today's program, Professor Barry Brook from the University of Adelaide, Australia, discusses the impact of the livestock industry on the environment. Professor Brook is an international research leader in global ecology and conservation biology. He holds the Foundation Sir Hubert Wilkins Chair of Climate Change and is Director of the Research Institute for Climate Change and Sustainability at the University of Adelaide. He has published 2 books and over 100 scientific papers on various aspects of human impacts on the natural environment and biodiversity. He has been awarded the Australian Academy of Science Fenner Medal, Edgeworth David Medal by the Royal Society of New South Wales and the H.G. Andrewartha Medal by the Royal Society of South Australia. Professor Brook was listed by Cosmos as one of Australia's top 10 young scientists. Professor Brook emphasises the need to recognise methane as a major contributor of greenhouse gases.
Methane is an interesting greenhouse gas. Many people may not have heard of it, but it's actually the second most powerful greenhouse gas in terms of humans' total contribution to climate change. So everyone's probably heard of CO2. Well, methane is another greenhouse gas that has a large impact, and it's especially important over shorter time periods. So methane is produced mainly by ruminant animals, and also it's released from fossil fuel reserves such as coal mines and gas fields. Those fires that we see at the top of an oil well, for instance, that's the flaring of methane. So methane is actually natural gas too that we would burn to heat water and so on. I've done some work recently with a couple of colleagues showing that in fact Australia's contribution to global warming is more to do with methane, at least in the short term, than it is with anything else. And even more than that, it's more to do with methane produced by ruminant animals, so cattle and sheep and goats, for instance. As part of their natural digestion process, they produce methane. They chew the cud, they have a second stomach, and inside that stomach there's bacteria that break down cellulose in grass to release energy. Well, that's a process that's known as an anaerobic process, so it's in the absence of oxygen, and that process causes the release of methane, mostly through belching. Now, because it's such a powerful greenhouse gas, it has a disproportionate effect on climate change. But most of its impact occurs over a fairly brief period of time, 10 or 20 years. Almost all the methane's gone. But if you look over that time period, then for every tonne of methane that's released, that's the equivalent to releasing 72 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So it packs a big punch. So to put that in context, Australia's cattle industry, livestock industry, cattle and sheep, currently releases about 3 million tonnes, thereabouts, of methane per year. Whereas our coal-fired power stations release about 180 million tonnes of CO2. So it sounds like coal-fired power stations contribute much more than our cattle do to global warming. But if you think that methane packs 72 times the punch of CO2 over a 20-year period, then over those next 2 decades, you multiply 3 by 72. Pretty easy to work out that our cattle and sheep industry actually contributes more to global warming than our coal-fired power stations over that period. So that's a vastly underappreciated fact in Australia.
Do you think that methane is underappreciated in recent submissions to the government?
Yeah, I think that's quite apparent. If you look at different greenhouse gases, they have a different contribution to global warming. So you need some method of standardising them. Now, the basic method that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses is to average everything over a 100-year period. Yeah. But for methane, that's actually a bit pointless because it's almost all gone after about 20 years. So you've taken all of its short-term contribution and smeared that out over 100 years to make it much less than it would otherwise be. So if you look at these reports, they'll suggest it has about 25 times the impact of CO2. But really, when it's up there in the atmosphere doing its work, it's 72 times the impact. And that makes a big difference. So I think it's underappreciated in those reports because of that accounting problem. And perhaps also because it's a problem a lot of people don't want to face. If we want to be serious about our emissions reductions, we have to account for agricultural emissions, and we have to, most importantly, account for Australia's greatest contribution in the short term to global warming, and that's methane.
So if we were to, have an effect on the animal agriculture, phase it out, would that buy us time with the CO2 technologies?
Yeah, because methane has a very powerful effect but a short-term effect, ironically you can do something about it pretty quickly compared to CO2. So although it's really important right now, it's something we can really purge out of our emissions very quickly. So for reasons disconnected with climate change, for instance, Australia's sheep population declined from about 190 million to less than 100 million since 1992. That's had a large impact on Australia's methane emissions. So it gives you an example of how quickly we can make that change, basically halved the emissions produced by Australia's sheep. There's no reason why you can't do that for cattle as well. Whereas to change over society's infrastructure, for instance from coal-fired power stations to alternative forms of energy, whilst that needs to happen very quickly, it requires a large turnover of capital infrastructure, things which tend to be, I think, economically more intractable, whereas reducing the head of cattle in Australia is something that could be done quickly, just over a couple of years, and have a huge impact on our global warming impact.
When Planet Earth, Our Loving Home returns, Professor Barry Brook will impart his latest research findings on meat consumption's greenhouse gas emissions. Please stay tuned to Supreme Master Television.